Thank you. Well, kia ora koutou, and thank you everyone for being here. Before I start, I do want to acknowledge today's events in which a police officer has been fatally shot. This is heartbreaking for the officer's family, friends and workmates, and we send our condolences to them. But today, I'd like to introduce you all to Air Commodore Darryn Webb, who you know has been appointed to oversee the operations of all quarantine and managed isolation facilities by the Prime Minister this week. Darryn has previously been in charge of the coordination of repatriation flights, and as such has a good understanding of the huge logistical challenge of repatriating hundreds of New Zealanders every day in the middle of a global Covid-19 pandemic. His new role is Head of Managed Isolation and Quarantine and will be in charge of all isolation and quarantine facilities. This means oversight of all processes within those facilities, including the provision of testing, enforcement of rules, logistical supply chains such as PPE, coordination of relevant agencies, standing up of new facilities, and continued oversight of repatriation flights. He also has accountability for those people who are in charge of each facility. And Darryn will shortly detail what actions we have taken in the last few days and what actions we will be undertaking in the next 72 hours to tackle the problems that have emerged in the last few days. I'm here today because in the last weeks the government has been working on a plan to transition the emergency response to COVID-19 to a tightly managed longer-term response. From 1 October, the overarching lead and coordination of responsibility for managed isolation and quarantine will shift to the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. Megan Main, the Deputy Chief Executive from MB, will be leading this work stream. MB is a key government agency that has the scale and scope to deal with complex issues and work across other government agencies. The Prime Minister has delegated responsibility for overseeing the managed isolation and quarantine facilities to me. This includes both the current operation of the current facilities and the development of a transition plan, which will be led between the All of Government group and MB in a work stream that will be taking place with Carolyn Tremaine and Mike Bush. As Housing Minister, I already have responsibility for the temporary accommodation service as part of the COVID response, and I have existing portfolios within MB. While our team of 5 million has achieved something very few other countries in the world have achieved in getting to level 1 with no community transmission, the reality is that we're living in a world where we've seen over 8 million confirmed cases and over 440,000 deaths. There are currently 3.6 million active cases of COVID around the globe. It is clear that the virus will be circulating in the world for some time to come. And it is also clear that New Zealand will continue to see cases. There are 100,000 cases being identified every day around the world. And it is obvious to anyone that as New Zealanders who have a right to come home into the country, some will be carrying the virus. But it is our job to protect New Zealanders. We must prepare for that and to ensure that our processes at the borders, managed isolation and quarantine facilities are robust. This week, we have seen that has not always been the case. There have been problems with the implementation of the testing regime. It did not meet our expectations, and it did not meet the expectations of New Zealanders. There have been issues with the rigour around approvals relating to testing, as well as numerous allegations of those in managed isolation mixing together. This is unacceptable, and we have acted with urgency to fix the problems that we have seen emerge. We fully accept that the expectations that we all had about how the managed isolation processes worked have not been working, and we have been taking action. The facilities that were fit for purpose in the immediate emergency phase are no longer what we need. We need to move the operation of facilities to having a single point of accountability and responsibility, and that person is Darryn. You will have heard today about the plan to ensure that COVID-19 tests that should have been carried out are being carried out. 700 tests have been completed today, and there is capacity to complete all day 3 and day 12 tests. The failure in the testing regime is being addressed, and Darryn's role includes oversight of the facility's processes and ensuring that testing people that are meant to have been tested are carried out. We must be vigilant in preserving the status we have got to as one of only a handful of countries amongst hundreds to the point we have with zero community transmission. Our focus must be on ensuring the virus's entry back onto our shores is fully contained. And that is why we have moved to ensure our managed isolation and quarantine procedures are solid. There are 4 facilities, these are level 4 facilities operating in a level 1 world. And we as a government have a responsibility to ensure that these facilities are managed in such a way that any potential spread of the virus is stopped in those facilities. But the people staying in those facilities also have an obligation and responsibilities to all of us. Every single person who wants to rejoin the team of 5 million has a role to play. Just as we all earned our shift back to level 1, we earned it by staying at home for 5 weeks. We stayed away from our extended families, people cancelled weddings, birthday parties didn't happen, and most tragically, people could not be with their loved ones in their final hours or grieve together. We did this to protect each other from the deadliest and most rampant disease we have seen in decades. We earned it by preparing our health system and our communities for the very real possibility that COVID could cause a wave of devastation that other countries have seen and are dealing with. The fact that it didn't happen is owed to our collective hard work. But let me be very clear, we cannot guarantee the behaviour of every individual in managed facilities or the quarantine facilities. This is a cross-section of New Zealand society. There are always people who will look to break the rules. But what I will guarantee is that we will have robust systems in place and there will be consequences for people who break those rules. We cannot give up our privileged position of having some of the most liberal settings and open economies in the middle of a global pandemic without a fight. Just as we were in level 4 for nearly 5 weeks, anyone coming onto our shores needs to adopt the same behaviours. While all people coming into our managed isolation and quarantine facilities are given information about hygiene and social distancing and are checked daily by medical staff, it is being made crystal clear to them what our expectations are of them. Just as the Prime Minister reiterated many times to all of us through levels 3 and 4, incoming people should act like they have COVID-19. And they should have regard to all the other people who have travelled in from overseas as if they have COVID. Because there is a very real possibility that some will do. They owe it to all of us who did the hard mahi through those weeks of level 3 and level 4. We need to absolutely guarantee to the nth degree that people joining our communities and rejoining our team of 5 million do not have COVID. And that's what their isolation period is all about. That is what testing can tell us, and that's why it's so important to get the assurance that testing gives us and to make sure we get it right. And we are determined to make this work because the alternative is unthinkable. Earlier this week, I joined Darryn for a visit to 2 managed isolation and quarantine facilities in Auckland. We spoke to staff on the ground, observed their management systems for processing people through accommodation, and were shown around the facilities. We saw people who are among the team of hundreds who are working incredibly hard to manage a very complex operation while also looking after the health and well-being needs of thousands of people every day. I'm now going to hand over to Darryn, who will outline the actions that we are and have been undertaking. Thanks, Darryn.
Thank you, Minister, and can also start by offering my sympathies to the New Zealand Police Force today. Firstly, I'd like to thank the staff on the ground and the amazing work that's been put in. Recent events have put their work into the spotlight, but it must be said that over 19,000 returnees have been through managed isolation. Our staff in these facilities have done a fantastic job to ensure the majority of these have been completed safely and returned back to their loved ones and friends. These staff have stood at the front line of New Zealand's main defence against Covid-19, and in the majority have been successful in keeping Covid-19 from entering our communities. However, as recent events have shown, we have not been 100% successful in our management of our isolation facilities, and there have been a number of situations that have highlighted this. As mentioned by the Minister and announced by the Prime Minister earlier in the week, I've been appointed as the Head of Managed Isolation and Quarantine. This means oversight of all processes within the facilities, including the provision of testing, enforcement of rules, logistical supply chains such as PPE, coordination of relevant agencies, standing up of new facilities, and continued oversight of repatriation flights. I also have accountability for those people who are in charge of each facility. In my new role, I have today commissioned an end-to-end review into the managed isolation and quarantine process from once they've been granted entry into New Zealand to departure after 14 days following the necessary exit protocols and have been assessed as low risk. Leading this review is Commodore Tony Miller from the Royal New Zealand Navy. He is being supported by Andy Milne, Deputy National Commissioner at the Department of Corrections, and Senior Sergeant Catherine Gibson from the New Zealand Police. The review team will be looking at end-to-end induction processes, general security and the safety of travellers, provision of health services, and standardisation of procedures including COVID testing and screening. This review will be completed over the coming days, and a final report will be presented to me next week. There is no doubt that this is a complex matter, but it is also the most important part of our collective defence against Covid-19 while we remain in a global pandemic. I understand that every New Zealander will be concerned by what has eventuated and will want to know as soon as possible that our processes and procedures are adequate. I am committed to ensuring we understand what has happened. As the Minister mentioned, we travelled together to Auckland on Wednesday for a site visit at one of the managed isolation facilities and a quarantine facility. Following on from this visit, and as the Minister has spoken to, we already have an understanding of what some of the issues are and have already taken action. The matter of staff and resources is something that I've taken immediate action on. Yesterday I received approval from the Chief of Defence Force for the deployment of additional personnel from the New Zealand Defence Force to double their on-site presence. This will increase defence personnel from 36 to 72 staff, with a number of these people having already arrived at these facilities today. Police's on-site presence will also be increasing, with additional staff in each facility and specifically identified after-hour support should it be required. These personnel will assist local staff in a number of roles, including ensuring the security and safety of returnees during their time in managed isolation. We know from what we are hearing from these hotels is that there's been issues with people coming into contact with others who have arrived prior to them, sometimes including those who have just arrived and those who are about to leave. I want to be clear, this is not acceptable. And these additional personnel will assist us in ensuring that this does not occur. As the Minister has said, we will have robust systems in place and strong accountability at both the national level through my role and at each of the facilities through a designated on-site operational lead. The Minister and I spoke with these leads earlier today to emphasise the criticality of their role. This includes my expectations and the rigour required in managing the exit process to ensure COVID does not enter our communities through the border. And I'll be following up with a letter to each of these leads on this. Nonetheless, returnees are left in no doubt that individual accountability sits at the core of our collective COVID fight. People must be responsible for their own actions. We didn't require a police officer or someone in an NZDF uniform to be on every street corner during the lockdown period, and each New Zealander played their part. We're asking the same of returnees during their stay in managed isolation and quarantine to take responsibility for their own actions and ensure they abide by our rules during their stay. I must be clear, people must take responsibility for their actions, and if they choose not to, there are consequences, which may include a $4,000 fine or 6 months in prison. Also, following the private event that was held at the Pullman Hotel, I have asked for a review of current arrangements with facilities to ensure that this does not happen again. I have determined that any facility being used for managed isolation is not used for private functions. This morning, the Minister and I spoke with the Director-General of Health on the matter of testing in facilities. He has advised that on Tuesday he has ramped up the testing at facilities for those at day 3 and day 12 of their stay. He has also prioritised the testing for those in the final days of their stay, with 927 returnees due to leave managed isolation over this weekend. Of those 927, we're expecting 247 to leave today, 450 tomorrow and 230 on Sunday. As the Director-General mentioned earlier today, over 6,000 tests were completed, including those required for returnees coming to the end of their stay. It will be a requirement of each of these returnees that they are considered low risk by the Ministry of Health, which includes the return of a negative test before they can leave. As evident from some who have already left facilities, this has not always occurred. I've made it clear to my staff on the ground that until they've received confirmation of the negative test result, no one is to leave. Finally, I want to address some of the matters that have been raised in the media over the last 24 hours in regards to my own involvement in managed isolation and quarantine to date. Up until the Prime Minister appointed me responsible for the end-to-end process of managed isolation and quarantine, including the provision of services for returnees, I had a role in leading a number of different parts of the overall system. This included the facilitation of over 19,000 arrivals from the airports to facilities, managing logistics support including security and safety, managing the walks and outdoor exercise at each facility, and the repatriation of over 62,000 foreign nationals out of New Zealand, such as their domestic travel to major hubs and their departure from New Zealand. I did not have responsibility for the provision of testing in facilities, any exemption applications and the approval process, the provision of health services, or any follow-up self-isolation plans or the assurance of those plans. As I said earlier, my new role now includes oversight of all processes within the facilities, including the provision of testing, enforcement of rules, logistics supply chains such as PPE, coordination of relevant agencies, standing up of new facilities, and continued oversight of repatriation flights. I also have accountability for those people who are in charge of each facility. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, and we're happy to take any questions.
Minister, on your new role, is that an acknowledgement that there wasn't adequate oversight of quarantines by the Health Minister?
What the new role about is actually the transition to the longer term arrangements that we'll have that will sit within MB. So it is actually about the time it is we move from the temporary emergency response to the long-term home for it, which will sit within an MB. It's analogous to what responsibility I took as a Minister of Housing for the TAS function that sat within MB, and I already hold 2 portfolios that sit within MB, so it seemed a reasonable, logical choice. I'll be working very closely with the Minister of Health because there are some statutory health functions that sit there, but in terms of the accountabilities and responsibility for the operations that sits at the moment with Darryn, and in terms of ministerial responsibility that sits with me.
Commodore, you said you were responsible before in your previous role for walks and exercise. We've heard of examples where people who are COVID-19 positive were mingling on their exercise in the car park at Jet Park Hotel with people who were potentially not COVID positive. So have you overseen breaches as well in your previous role?
I think it's fair to say that some of the systems in place haven't worked as well as we'd hoped, and one of my roles now is to make sure that we really bolster those processes and procedures, and continue to learn from those opportunities so that every New Zealander can feel safe.
A lot has been made about the complexities of this operation. To a layman, it wouldn't seem that complex. If somebody comes into a quarantine centre and leaves with 2 tests, why is it so complex?
Barry, to give you an idea of the complexity of this situation, so to date 20,151 people have been through a quarantine or managed facility. This has required 626 staff on the ground. This isn't just checking into a hotel and getting a test on the way in and on the way out. That there has been $81 million that will be spent to the 30th of June. And it requires not only the accommodation, it requires the food, the wraparound services, the logistics, the health services such as testing and security. One of the things that I was struck by when we visited the facilities earlier in the week was the high resourcing required to make one of these facilities work, and it's why we need to proceed with such caution and make sure we're matching capacity with our ability to receive people coming into the country. So it is a very complex operation.
Can you just clarify, with the October 1st, is that when MB takes over this role? Can you just clarify why you're in charge now if MB doesn't kick in until the 1st of October?
Because we'll be putting in place a transition plan. What we need to do is start moving that work through to MB. We expect that process to be complete by 1 October. But this is very much moving away from being a health response and the operations lying with health, with the operations shifting earlier within MB. So we're starting that shift as part of the transition plan.
Transition started earlier because of the botch-ups in health?
No, the work that we began on the transition began on the 8th of June. We had the first meeting where it was talked about me taking responsibility was on the 8th of June when we had a group of ministers that had a meeting. We decided that the best and most logical function for this to sit was the experience that I had in terms of the temporary accommodation service that came to me through my housing portfolio, and the fact that I am closely associated with the MB holding 2 portfolio responsibilities in there. So that decision was made several weeks ago.
Does it mean we see...
Sorry?
Are you becoming the Fix-It Minister? Are you becoming the Fix-It Minister?
Sorry?
Sorry, I just had a follow-up. Are you becoming the Fix-It Minister?
No, I don't know about that. We've certainly got some things that we need to fix here, and that's what we're concentrating on.
Does it mean we're going
Sorry,
to see...
I'm just here.
Doesn't
Thank you.
that visit defeat the purpose of an isolation facility if you went in there and now you're here giving a press conference and you've presumably been going about your daily work?
No, we behaved while we were in a quarantine facility, like everybody had COVID. That there are 626 staff across all of these facilities. Some of those work in a quarantine facility. That there are cold and hot zones within that facility where PPP is required in some areas. It is not allowed in others. We adhered to all the safety protocols while we were in that facility. We have both checked with health whether or not we required to either isolate or to have tests, but because we adhered to all the very strong procedures that were on that pertain to that site, there was no need to it. For the simple fact, we behaved like everybody there had COVID.
Sorry? The Health Minister said he had assurances that protocols were being carried out as expected. How are you going to assure that they definitely are this time?
Well, I think in terms of those protocols that I'm talking about, we saw them. So that would be the first instance. In terms of what we need to move to now in this next phase as we go through, that there is a clear operational lead with the accountabilities and responsibility. That one of the things that Darryn and I have talked about is daily reporting. That we will receive of the ins, the outs, the tests, and also any incidents at the facilities. So we will expect daily reporting on what is happening in each of our facilities.
The Prime Minister said yesterday that it was her focus now to regain the confidence of New Zealanders. Do you think that these moves that you've announced today are enough to do that going forward?
Well, I think what New Zealanders want to be sure of is that our managed isolation and our quarantine facilities are a very strong line of defence. I think what we have to have absolute confidence in, that we've had over 20,000 New Zealanders come home via these facilities. We have not had community outbreaks of COVID as a consequence of the way in which we've been managed. We need to ensure that remains the case. I think New Zealanders can have confidence in the swiftness in which we've moved. We already have increased resource. We've already sought assurances that the testing that is happening on the ground matches the regimes that it is our expectation that will be carried out.
Does this mean that we're going to see less of the Prime Minister in this role?
In terms of when it comes to managed isolation and quarantine, that is something that she has given me responsibility for leading, in the way that individual ministers have responsibility for a variety of issues, but that doesn't stop the Prime Minister also commenting on those, or journalists asking her on those issues.
Can you explain how the structure works? We've got John Ombler, we've got Mike Bush, we've got Darryn or Digby Webb, and we've got you. How does the structure work? So
the structure is reasonably simple, actually. So the all of government team sits under the auspices of the Chief Executive of the Department of Prime Minister of Cabinet, as is always the case. And we have Mike Bush and John Ombler within there, and Darryn can speak to this if he has anything more to add, that Darryn reports to Mike, I think it is the case. So that is his reporting line to there. Ministers sit somewhat outside of those official structures. That I am the person who the Prime Minister has delegated the responsibility for taking a lead at a ministerial level.
Minister, on the transition, why is it that the Ministry of Health and Minister of Health can't continue to run those facilities?
That what we have in the minister, that it is time for us to move the operations to a part of government that has more experience in operations. Let's not forget that the Ministry of Health is largely a policy ministry, that its operational arms is through the DHBs, that operations correctly as we transition to a longer term. I think what we're seeing is that this managed isolation is going to be with us for a time.
Then to that end, should have ever had responsibility for the running and management of quarantines and self-isolation?
Absolutely. This is about, as you do after any disaster, the transition away from the immediate response to what the longer term looks like. After any disaster, you stand things up quickly. The most logical agency at that point was health, to have responsibility there. It is now time to transfer that responsibility.
Did you have any responsibility or oversight whatsoever over at any stage the process of those two women coming into the country and then being released from self-isolation?
None whatsoever.
In the course of your review, obviously your review isn't finished yet, but in the course of undertaking that review, have you ascertained exactly what went wrong with those two women, where the break in the chain was?
We haven't looked into that particular case, and that will continue to be followed up.
It's been suggested by the Deputy Prime Minister that the people involved in that botched process should be found and made accountable. What's your opinion on this? Do you agree with him, or do you side with him, or do you think that would be more of a witch hunt?
All I'd say is my role's been clear from the Prime Minister, and that is to come on board this team and fix it going forward. So I'm definitely looking into the future. We know we can do things better, and that's exactly what we're going to do.
In your opening remarks there, Commodore, in your opening remarks you talked about the need for individual accountability and the potential for a 4K fine or 6 months in prison. Do you believe those two women had adequate individual accountability, and is there any chance that they could end up facing some of those ramifications?
In terms of, so they're the penalties that are defined under the Act, under the COVID Response Act. In terms of the breakdown there is actually around the fact that the test wasn't administered. That wasn't the fault of the women. That was the fault of the system, and what we're looking to ensure is fixed. We do have other examples, however, that we've seen in the media this week. People escaping who have had compassionate grounds to attend funerals. It's more those cases where we'd look for the penalties under the Act.
Dr. Bloomfield suggested this be appropriate for him to ask how a homeless man was able to enter the quarantine facilities. Do you have any more information as to how that was able to take place?
No, look, I'm really interested in that, in the crossover of my roles here, in terms of someone shouldn't be able to enter a quarantine facility from the outside. There should be a strict protocol for how someone is checked into one of those facilities, and I'll ask Darryn to speak to that a little more. But I'm also interested in, as the Minister of Housing, that we've stood up a large number of accommodation units, so that anyone who is homeless or rough sleeping doesn't need to be at the moment, that we have capacity to ensure that we don't have people without somewhere to safely shelter through this period.
What exactly will the 36? What
Sorry.
exactly?
Suggested Digby won't have some.
Oh, do you have anything more to say about how someone may enter a facility?
We have certainly looked into that specific example, and
Do you know if it happened?
I wouldn't want to say absolutely at this point. I'm still seeking the full data on that picture. All I would say is the systems are really robust as people enter, and everything we have to date shows no correlation between any flight manifest and any individual checking into that hotel.
So are you saying he didn't check it?
What exactly will the 36 New Zealand Defence Force staff be doing?
Yeah, great question. So clearly one of the concerns is physical separation of the people on the ground, and essentially these people will be there to help maintain that separation, the safety, security of the people who are checking in. It's a standard process as people come in and into the hotels, providing them with the right information, and really just that additional layer of assurance as we build that confidence in the system.
Yeah, Commodore, are you saying the man didn't check in?
I just have a follow-up question. Of the 626 staff on the ground, could you provide us with a breakdown of where they're from and what the expertise are?
Yeah. So there are essentially three main pillars of wraparound support. You have the hotel staff, which is vast majority of numbers. You have a security and logistics support arrangement, which includes, as I've said, defence, police, aviation security, and a number of other support agencies in smaller numbers. And then you have a health support element as well. So typically at each facility there will be approximately 15 people, and they're there on site 24/7 to support the returnees' needs.
Are you saying
Just further to that, I'll come to you, Barry. In terms of the breakdown, that we have 576 who are based in Auckland, 8 in Wellington and 42 in Christchurch. So
just to clarify, are you saying that this homeless man didn't get into a centre?
I'm not saying that.
Well, what are you saying?
I'm saying we're following up to make sure that everything in the system process is robust. And
what robust in this case was it, if he got into a quarantine centre?
Well, I haven't determined whether that was the case or not yet.
Well, so you don't know whether he got into it?
I think it's really clear that he's saying he's continued to follow it up.
Commodore, the question.
Yeah.
Are you saying
we will follow up and determine the answer?
It's an unfounded allegation right now. So
that's
the
right.
allegation has been made, but you haven't seen any evidence that proves it.
That's right.
On that
you're
next
not
step, would you prefer if the supposed to help actually went to you or to the police with these sorts of claims?
Absolutely. One of the things that we are standing up is a number of channels for people to be able to report concerns, so that we have been working with police this morning to make sure that the 10-5 number is the members of the public well understand that if they see things that concern them associated with the facilities, that there is a clear channel for them to report those concerns, and that can get to Darren's team quickly. One of the things I've also asked that we look into is a direct line of access for members of Parliament who hear something around how one of these facilities isn't operating, that they have a way in which they can channel that information, and we will take action on it quickly. This is actually about us dealing with problems as they arise, and I would prefer that that's how we did it.
Minister,
People who
the
isolated for a couple of days.
You've suspended compassionate exemptions at all entirely right now. Is it your ambition to ever bring those back?
Absolutely.
Is that possible?
So I'll just take that first. That absolutely, it is our aim to be able to bring back compassionate exemptions. I think all New Zealanders have looked with not able to imagine the not being able to be with someone who is dying or to join with others to grieve a loved one. We want to get back to a point that we can have exemptions for those, but we have to have absolute rock solid faith that the system is working and that we are not putting New Zealanders at risk by exercising compassion.
Isolated in Australia for a couple of days before coming here.
Sorry, I missed the first bit of your
People
question.
who've isolated in Australia for a couple of days first before coming here say it's much stricter. Essentially, they can't leave their rooms at all. Wouldn't that solve a lot of problems if that was the case here? Is that feasible?
Well, I've spoken to the Director of General Health on this sort of topic, and you need to understand that 14 days is a long time to be inside a single room, and the management of isolation needs to take into considerations the individual risk factors between staying inside a place for a long period and a set of procedures in place which are deemed to be safe and satisfactory for them to be managed in that area using separation protocols that clearly are set by health. So that's.
Is that it?
I'm just going to offer a comment there. I think that it is we are going to hear a lot of people's opinions about the various workings of the various facilities. I can also recount a conversation that Darren and I had with someone in one of the facilities when we visited during the week from a 2-metre distance around the fact that he was talking about how much better run the New Zealand facilities were, that he felt much safer in the New Zealand facilities. So I think that there'll be a range of opinions. What our job to do is to ensure that we have robust systems in the New Zealand facilities, whether they be managed isolation or they be quarantine. Sorry, at the back here.
Did you encounter a high degree of non-compliance? Is that part of the reason why these systems and protocols broke down?
We personally didn't encounter.
And, the managed isolation facilities, did they encounter a lot of non-compliance from people who are quarantined there? Is that part of the issue?
No, I don't believe so. There's been thousands of letters written to express their gratitude and support for the hard work done to make sure that their stay for 14 days has been as good as it could possibly be. Clearly there are instances, though, where the standards need to be improved.
The line of defence is only as strong as the behaviour of every individual. So even isolated cases of people not adhering to the rules are a concern for us. So it's not necessarily about large instances, it's about the fact that there are some well publicised instances of why we're taking action.
Mr. Woods, urban hotels aren't exactly designed for this kind of quarantine function that they're being used for. Do you see long term, given how long the borders are likely to be closed for, do you foresee long term actually moving to a more purpose-built kind of system?
Look, we're looking at a range of alternatives. While you say urban hotels aren't necessarily the best location, that what we also have to be doing is making sure that we're placing people into particularly quarantined and managed isolation, for that matter, in an area that matches with strong hospital capacity. Should the worst happen and there be an outbreak at a facility, we have to know that we're close to a medical centre that can deal with those individuals and treat them. So this is complicated and logistically complex. I think it's one of the things that we all need to consider when we hear calls for further loosening of the borders, just the logistics that sit behind bringing people across the border. Of the hotels that have been looked at by the All of Government group today, only a handful of them are actually suitable in terms of fulfilling all the criteria that are needed for managed isolation. So it's not simply a case of saying we'll go and book some hotels or book a facility. We have to match it with a range of services that we know should the worst happen.
Well, we've heard concerns of people in Tauranga on shore leave from cargo ships. Obviously, there's no managed isolation facilities there currently. They can isolate on the ship. Apparently, they can still come off the ship for days at a time. There's quite a lot of concerns about the possibility of the virus incubating on those ships. Are you at all worried about shore leave, and are you looking at tightening that up as part of that review?
There are a range of border papers and border measures that need to be put into place, and I would say that there is one standard for managed isolation, and that's the standard that we will enforce. We will be looking at expanding the needs of all managed isolation facilities to meet the increase in capacity across both air and maritime borders. So where there is a requirement to step up new places, we will certainly look to do that.
Of a gap in maritime borders right now, because obviously it's much less.
I think this is a good time to remind everybody that what we've been given responsibility for is the management of the isolation facilities and the quarantine facilities, not the border at large. We need to be working with colleagues across officials and ministers who are doing further work on the border to make sure we're matching capacity with any policy moves.
Can you scale up that capacity?
That is one of the critical issues that we're looking at in terms of the scalability. What I have to say is that we have to make sure that we are moving with caution, and we are taking a precautionary approach every time we do look at new facilities, that it is matched in the right area with access to healthcare. This isn't a case of flicking a switch and just being able to bring thousands of people across the border weekly. This is logistically difficult. It is resource heavy. We're seeing that the 20,000 people that we've brought in to date, we've got a staff of 626 people that has been assisting those people in their facilities.
Yeah, and certainly what we're seeing is every time there's a policy change, and particularly moving to alert level 1, there's an heightened desire for New Zealanders to travel back home. Earlier on, pre-COVID, 20,000 people came into New Zealand per day, and right now we're right back at just over 1% of that. So as the Minister said, the scaling up to meet that demand is a real challenge, and it's probably one of the most fundamental aspects of the job.
We're seeing weekly flights to Shanghai resuming next week. Is there a possibility that perhaps the private sector will get ahead of you and you won't be able to just match the numbers coming in?
We are monitoring that situation. Darren's team is working closely with the airlines, so we know the forecast flights that are coming in. One of the complexities of this situation is that how many people actually end up on the plane isn't really known until the door's shut. And of course, we're talking about returning New Zealand residents and citizens. Everybody has a right to come home. This isn't about choosing who we let across the border. These are people that have an absolute right to enter the country. So that we are working with the airlines around where they're going to be landing, what ports they're going to be in, looking at how we might be able to match that with capacity. But you are right. So as I said, we've had 20,151 people through managed isolation from the 26th of March 2020. The forecast next week could be as high as 3,229 people. So we have good eye of sight on the numbers, and this is why we brought in someone who understands logistics.
Has the total cost just so far of putting these people up for 2 weeks?
So to the 30th of June, the approximate cost will be $81 million.
Are you looking to move towards a co-payment system in the long term, given how expensive this is?
Look, that is certainly policy work that is being undertaken. It is a complex area of policy that is part of the longer term piece of work that we're doing.
And have you had anyone or aware of anyone who has left the country sort of since moving down alert levels and then returning in and then needing to be quarantined for whatever reason?
I just want to go back to your earlier question and give you one qualifier. Where we have had businesses bring in essential workers under exemption, there has been a user pay system around that. What I'm talking about is around the returning New Zealand citizens. In terms of people who have come in, left and then come back again, I'm not personally aware of cases, but that doesn't mean they don't exist, Darren. I don't know if you're aware.
Minister, on cost, do you have a blank cheque for this operation?
No, we do not have a blank cheque. This is something that we are doing some work around the policy that will be required. But there is a right of New Zealanders to return home.
What's the budget then? It's not a blank cheque.
We're working through those policy options, and we'll keep you updated.
An estimate though?
No, we're working through those policy options, and as that becomes more worked out, happy to share it with people.
The pay system, roughly how much is that per person, so we can have an idea of how much you would pay if it was?
You can do the math there. We've had 20,151 people to today, and we estimate we'll be spending 81 million.
You
In
say
terms
that
of
New
capacity,
Zealanders do have the right to come back to New Zealand, but if they choose to, where does that cost balance come up?
And that's exactly the policy work that we're working through at the moment in terms of how it is that you can bring people through when there's a requirement for quarantine and how that balance does sit.
in terms of capacity, what is the capacity that we have at the moment? And of that capacity, how much of that is full?
Currently we have 18 managed isolation facilities up and down New Zealand, 15 in Auckland, 1 in Wellington and 2 in Christchurch. We are currently scaling up additional capacity in Christchurch. We have at least another 1,000 rooms available to us in Christchurch, and we're looking to additional regions as the need arises.
Okay, just of those facilities, do you have a breakdown in terms of rooms?
We can make that available.
So those facilities, are they full, the 18 or not?
We certainly try and fill up hotels. We have aimed to have exclusive use contracts with these hotels, so we're making sure the managed isolation folks are in there segregated from other travelling New Zealanders, and so typically those hotels are very full.
That also is why the operations and logistics of this are so important, and why we had a meeting with the Director General of Health this morning around testing capacity over the weekend. We have 927 people that will be eligible to leave. We want to ensure that there is adequate testing that sits alongside that so that we can move those people on, that we're not waiting on their tests, because actually keeping movement through the facilities is really important. On Friday, 247 so today, 247 people are eligible to leave. Tomorrow, 450, and on Sunday, 230. And we know that we have more. We can do way more testing than that. We did 700 tests at hotels yesterday.
Some of those facilities still selling rooms to the general public?
No, these are exclusive use facilities.
How much urgency is there around scaling this up? Because as you said before, a lot of people are expected to come. How sort of urgent is the situation around finding more space?
We're constantly looking at that and managing the levers that we might have to manage the flow. So currently those are commercial arrangements. We are working with the Ministry of Transport to understand the policy settings that might be applied to ensure that we don't have a situation where we can't manage the supply.
In Commodore, we've seen examples of staff at managed isolation facilities almost actively facilitating people mingling. In the case of a child's birthday, a staff member cut the cake and handed it out to all the children there. Should we expect to see the end of that kind of thing, and are staff members confused about what they're supposed to be doing?
Yeah, and as humans, it's only natural to want to do the best for people inside their own facilities, but absolutely we are resetting the expectations that that sort of behaviour doesn't meet the requirements for our on-site management of returnees, and we'll be making those expectations crystal clear.
And that was the subject of the phone call that we had with the operational leads this morning.
Does this 48-minute press conference remind you of the odd Kiwi Build press conference?
I love a long press conference.
Can you clarify for us, is it Digby or is it Darryn?
If my mother was answering, she'd say Darryn.
What's your mother?
Like a lot of people out there, you gather nicknames over time, so my nickname is Digby. I don't mind either.
Thank you.
Thank you.